Welcome to ARDEX Answers podcast, where you'll find the latest and greatest on flooring, tiling and waterproofing, as well as general construction for the Australian building industry.
Welcome back to ARDEX Answers. I'm Monique Fenech from ARDEX, and joining us on the couch today is James Bradford, our Technical Services Advisor at ARDEX. Welcome, James.
Thank you.
Today's topic is bonded versus unbonded screeds. So, James, what are the typical applications for screeds in tiling projects?
Tilers use screeds to create falls in wet areas, balconies and stuff like that. They're also mainly used to create a good flat substrate, level substrate for them to install their tiles on. Another reason they're used is to build up for height differences from room to room and stuff like that. They're your main reason. There's other reasons for it, but they're the main reasons that you'd use a screed.
So then, can you explain the main differences between bonded and unbonded screeds?
A bonded screed is exactly what it is called. It's bonded directly to the substrate, which is generally a concrete substrate. So you create what we call a slurry, and then you apply the screed mix onto the slurry wet on wet, and that's what it's physically bonded to the substrate. As in, an unbonded is exactly the opposite. It's not bonded to the substrate. So usually on sheeted floors, like sky-on floors, stuff like that, you'd have 2 layers of builder's plastic, and then you'd put your sand and cement on top of that. So basically it's independent to the substrate. You're basically separating it, you're unbonding it, or a floating screed as they like to call it.
So James, in what situations would you recommend using an unbonded screed instead of a bonded one?
Usually I would recommend using an unbonded screed if you're going over a sheeted floor, such as sky-on or something like that. Sheeted floors especially as well, because they're on a timber frame, so you can get a lot more movement and expansion and contraction from the timber frame than you can from a concrete slab, basically. So if you tried to bond a screed directly to a sheeted floor, you're taking a risk that you could end up getting cracking, because if the flooring's moving underneath, or expanding and contracting, which they do, you can end up getting cracking transferring through the screed, and then eventually it could end up cracking through your tiles, and you get hairline cracks running through your tiles from movement from the substrate. So by doing an unbonded screed, you're basically separating it from having that issue.
That sounds like an advantage.
It is.
So, and a bonded one, what would be some of the reasons why you'd definitely go down that path?
A bonded one, you wouldn't try and bond it really to a sheeted substrate. You'd go with unbonded. Bonded is generally just used for concrete. So you're basically making it one solid component. You've got the concrete, and then you've bonded a sand and cement screed to it. So it sounds solid. It is a solid substrate as opposed to a floating one.
Yeah, makes sense. What are the key considerations when preparing a substrate for a bonded screed?
You've got to make sure with a bonded screed, as I said previously, that you create what we call a slurry. Now that could be a mix of water and neat cement that's mixed into a paste, and it's spread over the floor as a wet cement paste, or you can use an additive with it, with some of the sand and cement. You can use an additive in the water with neat cement, or some of the product itself. Like if it's an engineered screed, you can use some of the product itself, and you create a slurry again over the floor. So, and you have to apply the sand and cement screed, whether it be a bonded screed, directly to it wet on wet. If you let the slurry dry and then apply the sand and cement on top, it just won't stick. It's not going to bond properly. So you need to make sure that it's a wet on wet application.
How long would that drying take for the slurry?
It does depend. It depends on how porous the concrete substrate could be. Sometimes you can slurry the floor, and by the time you've gone out to get your buckets of sand and cement to tip on the floor, it's already the suction in the concrete slab's already drawn the moisture out of the slurry, so then you have to reactivate it again before you put the sand and cement on top. It's very important.
Yeah, okay. And James, how does the thickness of the screed differ between bonded and unbonded applications?
Yeah, it does differ quite a lot actually. So the minimum thickness we recommend for a bonded screed is 15 millimetres at the lowest point. Mm-hmm. So, and normally the lowest point is in the bathroom, is where your water goes down the drain. So basically we never recommend that they go less than 15 millimetres for a bonded screed. An unbonded screed has to be a lot thicker, minimum of 40 mil thick at the lowest point. to allow for strength because it's not bonded to the substrate, so it's just floating there. And generally with an unbonded screed, you would generally run a mesh through the centre of the screed to reinforce the screed. But if that's with traditional sand and cement, if you were using an engineered screed, they generally don't require to have reinforcement applied to them because they possess a lot more compressive strength than a traditional sand and cement.
What can go wrong with screeds?
Bonded, the main thing that can go wrong is if they go thinner than the 15 mil that we recommend, because it just won't possess the strength that you need. So you can end up getting cracking, or it'll crumble and fall apart because it's just not strong enough to be there if they're going below that 15 mil. Another one is what I said previously, if they don't do the wet on wet application with the slurry on the floor, then it just won't stick and it will just sound hollow, and it will just basically, you need to remove it and start again.
Right. It sounds hollow before you tile or after you tile?
Yeah, it would sound in both. If you don't notice it before you've tiled, you'll notice it after you've tiled.
Which is a bad situation.
If you were to tap on it, it would sound hollow, like it's not stuck, you'd hear it. And then anything you put on top of that, then, if you don't notice it and then go and tile on top of it, your tiles are going to sound drummy.
Yeah, and those cracks will be evident.
Yeah.
And you mentioned cracks too in the other situation of the unbonded screed, if that's not done correctly as well.
Yeah, the unbonded screed, you've got to make sure it's minimum of 40 mil thick, which can throw out a lot of people because they don't allow for the heights. 40 mil thick at the lowest point can end up quite thick once you take your falls into account and stuff like that. So that's one thing that has to be taken in consideration with an unbonded screed. If you try and make them too thin, yes, they can crack because they're not bonded down, they're just floating there basically. That's why we always recommend the reinforcement to be put in. Yeah. Especially with traditional sand and cement. As I said, you don't need it with an engineered screed.
Yeah. And how can this problem be reversed?
It would basically get your jackhammer out and remove it.
Okay,
so if it's not, it would need to be removed. There's not really many instances that you'd be able to rectify the screed. If there was one little drummy patch in there, you may be able to remove it and repair it, but it's never going to be as good as if it was done correctly in the first place. If there's drummy sections all over the whole floor, then yes, you've got no choice but to remove it.
Well, James, thanks for joining us for today's podcast on screeding. It was really interesting, and we're looking forward to more topics from listeners out there. So please fill in the form on the podcast channel, and we'd love to answer those with our technical advisors and experts at ARDEX.
No worries, thanks.
Bye for now.